Welcome to the Title IX at 50 Educate and Advocate webcast. My name is Kathleen Mangano, and I am speaking here today with Erin Buzuvis. During our time together, I will ask our Title IX expert a few questions to help educate us on this important civil rights law, and wrap up by asking her to share a piece of advice on how we can advocate to strengthen and secure Title IX. Let me begin by sharing her background information. Erin has been a professor of law since 2006 and associate dean for academic affairs since 2020 at Western New England University. She teaches courses in employment discrimination, sport law and culture, and Title IX, to name a few. Erin is a prominent educator and researcher. She has published 7 book chapters and over 25 journal articles, specifically in the areas of gender and discrimination in education and athletics. Erin is sought after for her Title IX expertise by such organizations as the New York Times, National Public Radio, Sports Illustrated, and the Women's Sports Foundation. Erin, thank you for joining me today to discuss Title IX.
Thank you, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. My first question, what problems did Title IX address?
Interestingly, it was not aimed at any problems related to sport at the time that it was passed through Congress. So the advocates who were interested in passing this law that would create a civil rights law, a civil rights provision that would ensure gender equity in education, were primarily concerned about caps and quotas in admissions. So there were higher ed programs at the time in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, like law schools, medical schools, PhD programs, largely in the graduate area, that would have a limit on the number of women that they would admit. And once they filled that cap, once they said, oh, we've got our 20%, women, or whatever their number was, they wouldn't accept any more. And the reason for that was due to social stereotype, or due to prevailing stereotypes about women's status in society, and the expectation that they were really just in college to find a husband and weren't really planning to use their degree for the purpose it was intended. So schools didn't want to waste those slots on people who weren't serious about their education. So advocates aimed their efforts at that particular problem, but the language of the law that passed ended up being very broad. It just says no sex discrimination in federally funded education programs. There are a few exceptions that allow for, private single-sex colleges, for example. But that broad language then sort of opened the door to how is this going to apply to athletics. So I'll stop that answer because I think your next question is going to probably allow me to pick up on that point and move on.
Well, your point regarding it wasn't directed at athletics. We have to be thankful for that keyword activity. Yeah. Yes,
exactly. And there was some debate after Title IX's passage about what that really meant. Did the activity itself had to receive federal funding? And the answer eventually had to work its way back through Congress to confirm that no, as long as any part of the institution is receiving funding, then that any activity within the purview of that institution has to comply with the law.
Yes, and we know lots of people try to fight that word in athletics. So
yes, the NCAA was one of the early objectors. Eventually they came around to women's sports, but at the time there was concern that if Title IX applied to athletics, that it would kill that it would kill football, that it would kill men's sports as it existed at the time, instead of bringing women's sports up to that same level of funding and same level of support, that it would detract. Yes, and along the way, some sharing of resources and things like that have had to be worked out, but obviously, men's college football still stands. So Title IX did not destroy anything.
You got it. Great. Thank you. My second question, what 3 criteria of Title IX determine equal opportunity? And can you please explain each?
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of the next step in Title IX's application to athletics, once it became confirmed that that would so apply, it got turned over to a federal agency then called Health, Education, and Welfare. It's the predecessor to our Department of Education today, to set the criteria for how Title IX would apply to athletics. And so a couple of key decisions had to be made. First was to allow a kind of separate but equal framework to take hold, as opposed to a rule that just says, okay, every team's open to whomever can make the team. And that kind of model would have likely frozen women's sports in its low participation at the time, because having not had access to athletic opportunities, it would be not thinkable for women to try out for the existing teams and to be able to make the teams based on the athletic support and talent development that they'd had up until that time point. So separate but equal was really given some prominent discussion in these early regulations to say it has to be equal in terms of number and in terms of quality. So quantity and quality, how many opportunities you're offering to women, and then those opportunities have to have equivalent access to equipment. You can't give women your hand-me-down equipment. You can't give them the second choice in terms of when you're scheduling them to use the facilities, and they can't have the mediocre locker rooms if the men's team has high quality locker rooms. So there's that quality piece, but the three criteria that I think you're asking about has to do with quantity of athletic opportunities. And this was meant to kind of recognize that schools are in different places at the time, and let's meet people where they're at, give some options for compliance. So the three criteria break down like this. If you have proportionate athletic opportunities, then you're all set. You don't need to do any more work. And what proportionate means is you take a look at your undergraduate student population and what's the gender breakdown there. So if your student body is 50-50, male, female, then as long as your athletic opportunities also break down 50-50 male, female, then you're proportionate. These days, at the time those regs were written, women were minorities among college students, which was maybe why that test was appealing at the time. Today, women tend to outnumber men in undergraduate institution enrollment at most schools, not all, but most. And so the expectation there for proportionality compliance would be you'd have to have more athletic opportunities for women than for men. And as it turns out, most schools have not kept pace and have let women's enrollment grow without keeping, without continuing to develop women's athletic opportunities at the same rate. And so those schools are now scrambling to figure out, do we comply with one of the other two tests? So that brings us to the next test is called History and Continuing Practice of Program Expansion for the Underrepresented Sex. So whichever sex is underrepresented in terms of athletic opportunities, which at most institutions these days, that means women, are you able to show that over the lifespan of Title IX, you have been chipping away at that participation gap by gradually adding opportunities for women? And so, there's not a numerical formula here, but if you've taken a decade off in terms of adding sports for women, if you were, slow to get started and have not, tried to kind of compensate in recent years with more rapid expansion, then you're unlikely to satisfy this test. I think it's safe to say at this point, Title IX's 50th year, that if you have truly complied with the spirit of the second test and gradually been increasing opportunities for women in the way that test was intended, that you would have attained proportionality by now, or compliance with the third test that I'll tell you about in a minute. So, I don't want to call it a dead letter necessarily, but it would be unusual, I think, to have a school that is genuinely in compliance with prong 2 as opposed to either of the other two tests. Maybe a school whose athletic department is new. perhaps. Okay, so then there's the third test. What happens if you don't meet either of those two? That's a test that asks whether, notwithstanding the disparity, notwithstanding the fact that women are underrepresented, are they fully satisfied with the athletic opportunities that are made available to them? And so, if you can show that, hey, even if we added another team, like the women here are all set, and they would not show up for another sport that was added. There is not unmet demand out there for another women's sport at this school. If you can show that, then you comply with prong 3. But think about how challenging that showing would actually be. If a school was pressed to make that demonstration, what would they be able to say? Any school that is, first of all, in the position of eliminating an existing women's team probably does not comply with that third test. Any school that's in a conference that has, where the conference is supporting, lots of schools in your conference have a women's lacrosse team, but you don't have a women's lacrosse team. Isn't the existence of that team and the popularity within your conference, which are your peer institutions, they're drawing from the same type of student that you are, and you're able to say, oh no, women wouldn't play lacrosse here, right? So the presence of a sport among your peers that you don't offer is likely evidence of unmet interest, as is a sport that's popular as a high school sport in the state that you draw your students from. So any kind of situation where you are, where there's evidence that there's a sport out there that if you offered it, and if you treated it the same as the other sports in your program, which for most colleges means some form of recruiting. So I'm not even asking about whether your current students there'd be enough interest in a random sport, say women's lacrosse, to stick with the example, pull your current student body and say, oh, well, the current students here don't want to play lacrosse, so we're fine. Well, of course they don't want to play lacrosse. They came to your school, even though you don't have lacrosse. Right. So the test is really about, looking hypothetically at who would be in your student body if you had that sport. That's why we look to some of those other indicators of interest, like your competitor schools and the popularity of sports in your region. And so a lot of times schools are kind of, not really in compliance with any one of those tests. And it takes either a lawsuit or an investigation by the Department of Education to sort of call the question and say, okay, college, which of the prongs do you think you comply with? Right. Because maybe you're not really in compliance with any one of those and you need to get your act together. So we can talk more about what that means. I think that'll probably come up in other questions. So there it is, the three compliance prongs and how that fits into athletics compliance overall.
Well, great breakdown of the three, and the infamous, if you build it, they will come. And the other point, as you were talking, we've been in, Title IX, 72, interpretation, et cetera, 79. And this is, over 40 plus years, they've been trying to, and so many people or institutions are not in compliance with the three. And they had a long time to do it. So it's kind of sad.
Yeah,
that's very sad. So thank you. My third question, how does Title IX specifically protect transgender and gender nonconforming students and the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, well, that's a perfectly reasonable question. The word specifically in there is what makes it challenging at this moment in time, because there is definitely, at the moment, I would say, an evolution of interpretation and understanding on that question at a specific level. At a general level, I can say that Title IX's general prohibition against sex discrimination means that trans students are included. And so anything where that's, any situation where that's straightforward, like admissions, a school can't say, oh, we're not going to allow any trans students into this institution. We're not going to let them take these classes or hire them for these work study positions, or, anything that's sort of in that, that the general mainstream program where people are admitted of all sexes and it's just transgender people who are excluded, that's going to violate Title IX. Where there is some debate is how trans students should be treated in single-sex facilities and single-sex programs. So is it discrimination under Title IX to say, okay, you can come to our college and you can play sports, but to a trans woman, you can't play women's sports? Right. I believe that there is a very persuasive and reasonable interpretation of Title IX that does give rights to trans students to be treated as the gender with which they identify for purposes of participating in sports, using locker rooms and bathrooms, and using, and being assigned to dormitories and things like that. There are people who disagree with that interpretation. And then there's also some gray area around whether any and to what extent any kind of conditions can be imposed on a transgender student's participation in athletics. So for example, at the college level, there has historically been some expectation and some, I should say requirement that a trans woman competing in women's sports will have undergone some transition with hormones to make her body more similar to a cisgender woman's body. And that has been acceptable up until this point. And so that's a possibility that Title IX would somehow allow that in keeping with tradition. On the other hand, in the K through 12 context, where Title IX also applies, requiring students to undergo medical treatment that they might not be ready to decide about for the purposes of athletics sounds a little different, and sounds like that's a much higher burden on the student for athletics that is also less competitive and more participatory. So in terms of the balance of interests, it may turn out to be that Title IX provides stronger protection in the K through 12 context. At least I think that's a persuasive policy, it's a persuasive outcome in terms of the policy and where it should end up. That's what I actually personally advocate for. And we'll have to see how that shakes out. Couple different government entities are going to have a role in shaping this, this clarification that we're sort of waiting for. It might be that the Department of Education eventually takes a look at this and clarifies it in its regulations. And, if that doesn't happen, or even if it does, there's also a role for the courts to play here, as states with bans on trans women and girls' participation in sports are being challenged in court. The outcome of those cases, the judicial decisions that are going to come from those cases, are going to also shape the rights of trans students. So we have a couple steps to wait for in terms of the detail, but that's sort of what's coming and what's on the horizon.
Great, thanks. Yes. Well, lots to look forward to on that end.
Yes.
So good. My last question. What are the arguments against having Title IX?
Yeah, against having Title IX. I don't think that people are out there arguing that Title IX should be, completely withdrawn. I think where we are seeing arguments in this day and age have to do with the scope of protections that exist under Title IX, and some of the hot button issues are actually, Title IX's application outside of the context of athletics. There's currently debate in the political sphere, and actually an ongoing effort to revise Title IX's regulations that largely has to do with how schools treat situations of sexual misconduct between students. And so in that situation, there are people who believe that schools should be, you should have the leeway to to provide, to engage in punishment and to suspend and expel students who engage in sexual misconduct. And then the counter argument to that isn't so much that schools shouldn't be able to expel students who engage in sexual misconduct, but that they should have to go through criminal trial type procedures in order to reach that conclusion. So there's some disagreement there. I wouldn't say it's an argument against Title IX, but how strongly does Title IX protect students who have been victims of sexual misconduct? Other areas of controversy, we just talked about transgender students' rights. That's very, there are people pushing back on Title IX's application in that realm, and arguing that trans students should have fewer rights. I think we also still, from time to time, still hear arguments about, that there should be more flexibility in the law for athletic departments to favor men's programs. I think that, sometimes these arguments are rooted in arguments about money, as if college sports is a business, when in fact, these are nonprofit entities that are taking advantage of federal funding and nonprofit tax status. And you know what, you got to comply with civil rights laws. You don't get to say, oh, well, profit means we need to make sure that, that men's sports have more resources. So, those are kind of, I think that's probably a good overview in terms of examples where there's some opposition to Title IX being applied as strongly as advocates would like.
Yeah, well, the infamous dollar, the dollar talks a lot, unfortunately. So thank you. Those are the questions. If you could please, my final comment is if you could please share with us any advice you have on how we can advocate for that.
Yeah. So this brings me back to my earlier point about how schools might not be in compliance with any of the three prongs. And it's not going to be until somebody pushes their feet to the fire that is going to trigger an honest self-analysis where the institution is going to really dig deep and say, okay, yeah, there are, we don't comply with prong 3 because there are sports that we could offer, or, oh gosh, it's been way too long since we have added women's sports. We clearly don't comply with prong 2 either. And yes, our numbers are off because women have been gaining in enrollment, right? So what's, until there is pressure on an institution to actually consider whether they're in compliance with one of those three prongs, oftentimes, colleges and universities are putting that off. And not just colleges and universities, K through 12 as well. So my advocacy advice is going to be, if everybody watching this took one institution that they cared about and started doing some digging into into a basic compliance analysis, and it should be, for example, available on the website who the Title IX coordinator of any education institution is. And that Title IX coordinator should have answers about how that institution is complying in terms of athletics with Title IX. Oftentimes the Title IX coordinators are really focused on sexual misconduct and other pieces, and maybe they don't know. We should be able to get that information to you. And with a little bit of knowledge about how those three prongs work, you now, as members of the public, know to be suspicious of a school that claims to be complying with prong 2, or they claim to be complying with prong 3, and for sure that there are popular sports in the region or in their conference that they're not offering, and to be able to to make that argument, first with respect to the institution, the power brokers at the institution itself, the Title IX coordinator, people in athletics, if you can get their attention. And if that doesn't work, anyone can file a complaint with the Department of Education. Go to the Office for Civil Rights website, and there is a link that will take you to a complaint form. And you don't have to have a specific connection to an institution. You can describe what you think is a violation of Title IX in your own words. And they are required to read it, and a little bit of preliminary analysis on their end will determine whether it's something that they feel is worth pushing. But they can start an investigation based on a complaint from a member of the public in some circumstances. So if we're putting more pressure on athletic departments that way, I think that is a way that we can help close the compliance gaps that are remaining even 50 years from Title IX's passage.
Well, thank you. Great advice indeed. So, well, Erin, this has been incredible information. Thank you for what you have shared with us today. It's extremely valuable. Your expertise in Title IX is impressive and noteworthy. I want to thank you for taking time to be part of my webcast, and thank you for all you do to educate and advocate for Title IX. And I hope you have a great academic year.
Same to you, Kathy. This is such a valuable project. I'm glad you're doing it, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Thank you.